Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joined today by two extraordinary women who I admire hugely. First of all, we have Daisy Goodwin, who wrote the script for the acclaimed ITV series Victoria, which is a Sunday night staple. And then we have Amanda Foreman, author of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, which was made into the Oscar-winning bodice-ripper, the Duchess. So can we just have a very warm Clifden welcome to both of these incredible women. So I know we're all bursting with questions, but it's my good fortune to go first. So my question to both of you was it fun, the process of turning these characters, seeing them on screen? Has it been a fun, exciting process for you? Daisy, I'm going to come to you first.
Now it's all behind me. Yes, fantastic. Yes, I mean, my relationship with Victoria started when I was a student at Cambridge, and I was studying Queen Victoria in the media, and I was sitting in the university library, and which is a very sort of hushed place. And at that time, my sort of picture of Victoria was of this grumpy old trout, in a bonnet, who wears black and is not amused by anything. And then I was told to read her early diaries, so I started to read her early diaries.
Who told you to read?
David Cannadine, my tutor at Cambridge and Queen Victoria, he said, you've got to read her diaries to get an understanding of how she relates to the media. Anyway, so I'm 19 years old, I open the diary, and she's 19 years old, it's 1839, she's just got engaged to Albert, and she writes about, my dearest Albert, he looks so fine and handsome in his tight white cashmere pantaloons, nothing underneath. And I just thought, whoa, there is a girl after my own heart. And in a sense, what I've tried to do with the show is to give everybody else that revelation that Victoria was not a grumpy old trout. She was, at the beginning of her life, a young, passionate woman, full of hormones, excitement. She wanted to know all about life. She was curious. She loved parties. She loved dogs. She loved music. She loved men. And I wanted to bring that Victoria to life. So for me, that was glorious. And it was compounded by the fact that at the time, I had a 15-year-old daughter who was about the same size as Victoria, 5 foot nothing. And that's part of my visualisation of her as a character, that she's always this little person looking up at this forest of grey-bearded old men. And anyway, so my tiny 15-year-old is giving me a very hard time about how she hasn't done her homework and da-di-da-di-da-di-da, and she's screaming at me, and she's this bundle of hormones and passion and anger. And I thought, my goodness, what would it be like if this child tomorrow woke up and found herself to be the most powerful woman in the world, because that's exactly what happened to Victoria. And so I thought that's the beginning of a drama.
So we're going to go back to your rebranding of Victoria in a minute, but I want to talk to you. I want to hear from you, Amanda, about what it was like. Was it a fun process to see your heroine brought to screen?
Yes, it was. I mean, I just want to add something about what Daisy's just said, though, which is that I remember going to a lecture given by David Cannadine and him beginning by saying, well, Queen Victoria loved sex. and I never really quite sort of believed it. And one of the things I love about Victoria is how Daisy's kind of brought David Cannadine's words and made it flesh, and it is just marvellous. And I think it's the corporality of the film, which is so exciting. When Georgiana, when the Duchess was being filmed, I remember going to Greenwich, which had been totally transformed into an 18th century street. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people making this reality. There were extras, hundreds of extras. There were people who had made a market. We had live animals, we had straw, we had horses, we had carriages. Thousands of people in the most amazing 18th century costume. And looking out at it all, and 2 acres of an 18th century world, I remember crying. Because I thought that something that I had conceived in my mind and spent years over, I was now experiencing visually, and it wasn't just me, it was everyone partaking in it. And it was one of the most moving moments in my life to see that.
So picking up from that, you write very movingly in the introduction of Georgiana, which I've read many, many times, about experiencing Stockholm Syndrome with the subject of your biography. You fell in love with her, you were incredibly defensive of her. If you read a letter that was in any way remotely critical of her, you felt a sense of injustice on her behalf. How did it feel for you to surrender your heroine to the clutches of Hollywood?
Well, you know, there are lots of ways that you can take that, and I remember being very protective and this and that, and then one day someone pulled me aside and said, you know, when you sell your house, do you go back to the new owners and say, what the hell have you done to my kitchen? No, you don't. You took the money. And that's how you have to feel about your book. You sold them the book. You took their money. Be grateful and let them get on with it. And it was the best advice ever. Now, I'm happy with the film. It sold 1 million copies for me. I should be sending them flowers. You know. It's different from the book. And, you know, and God bless them. It didn't lessen my work or my vision of Georgiana. It's just a different one.
Okay, going back to a point that you made about rebranding Victoria, was that something that you consciously did?
I remember when I was filming the first series, we were doing Victoria's wedding in Beverley Minster, which is the most, it's very close to Westminster Abbey, and it's the most extraordinary building. And it was, you know, I felt the same thing as Amanda does, of, you know, seeing them all dressed up and, you know, Victoria and Albert in their wedding dress. I mean, it was a very, very moving moment because, you know, they're getting married, and it felt somehow sacred. I don't know, I mean, that's a bit much, but that's sort of what I felt. But anyway, a man from the Telegraph came up to me and he said, so the series, is it a feminist interpretation of Victoria? And I was just thinking, and it rather took me aback because it hadn't occurred to me that there was anything feminist about it. But of course, I realised that in a world where you don't see many young women at the heart of a television series unless they're the girlfriend or, you know, somehow, or someone who's about to be raped. It was actually rather a feminist statement to have a young woman who's at the heart of, who is the person in charge, who is the motor of the series. In itself, there's something transgressive still about having a young woman at the centre of a TV series, even if she is a queen. So in a funny way, you know, the kind of reaction to Victoria when she came to the throne, which is of, can she do it? Is she up to it? She's a woman, she's a young girl, is she up to the job? That was sort of being slightly mirrored, I felt, by this man from the Telegraph. The Telegraph, I'm sure he didn't mean it like that, but it was a moment. So I suppose I didn't set out to do anything other than tell the story of Victoria as I saw it, as she was inhabiting me at that point, because I think there is a point at which you become your character quite seriously.
But my vision of Victoria before seeing your TV series that I'm absolutely addicted to, 9 o'clock every Sunday night, last episode tonight,
yeah.
Is it this old shrunken lady in widow's shrouds, and before me I see this incredibly vigorous, young, beautiful Jenna Coleman having a passionate relationship with her prince. Was that a story that you had was that something that you intended to tell? Was that a narrative that you had, that you would have liked to tell, or did that just transpire from reading those diaries?
It came from the diaries. I mean, you know, as I said, you know, my Damascene moment was the, you know, white cashmere pantaloons, nothing underneath, and you know, and if you read her diaries, it's all about, oh, we had no fun last night because Albert was opening, you know, a factory somewhere. So fun is a euphemism, obviously, for that was her preferred term. So she was very, very interested in sex. I mean, that was a motive for her. I mean, she was a very passionate, she was a Hanoverian. She had lots of hormones. They had 6 children in 8 years. That doesn't happen by accident.
But she hated being pregnant, didn't she?
She hated pregnancy. She didn't really want, I mean, I don't think she hated her children, but she didn't really enjoy all the business of pregnancy. But on the other hand, she couldn't resist Albert. And Albert, you have to remember, has a slightly ambiguous attitude towards all of this, because while she's pregnant and when she's given birth, he's in charge and he really quite wants to be king. And one of the things I love about Albert is that when he designs Osborne, you know, their house on the Isle of Wight, he designs every aspect of this house, but the one detail I will always remember is he's got this special gadget so that when they get into bed, he can just press a button and this lock, this sort of contraption goes all the way around the room and it locks the door so that no one can come in and disturb them.
Sounds a bit
Yes.
50 Shades.
Well, it's
50 Shades of Monarchy.
50 Shades of Monarchy or James Bond, you know. I mean, but you know, they wanted to. And if you go to Osborne, if anyone's been to Osborne, there's so much naked flesh on the walls that they obviously had they did have quite a sexy time. I mean, they've got their study here, and in front of them is a sort of canvas, you know, a huge canvas of the Rape of the Sabine Women by Winterhalter, which is just, you know, a lot of naked women and men. So, you know, they were much more broad-minded than you might imagine.
Good for them.
Ooh.
So, Amanda, if you don't mind me saying, you spoke rather transactionally before about passing over your beloved heroine to Hollywood. Did you have any disagreements with filmmakers, with the filmmakers? Is there anything that you wish had been different about the movie? Do you have any regrets about signing her over?
Well, and this isn't anything that I didn't say to them before I launch into this. The one problem I have with the film is that I don't believe that it believed in her. It loved her as a character who was beautiful and wore clothes and inspired, lots of inspiration going on. But what does the film say about Georgiana? The film says that she's important and interesting because the future Prime Minister of England fell in love with her. That is the message that I took away from that film. That is not the message of the book at all. So yesterday we had this panel and we were talking about agency versus symbolism. And I feel that one of the reasons why Daisy's writing and Victoria is so compelling is that we're watching a television series about a woman with agency. And that is totally a conviction that goes right through, it's the spine of that series. And it did not happen in The Duchess. They did not believe that she herself had agency. It wasn't even in the philosophical universe of the filmmakers that
Yes, that's a good point, yeah.
she had it. And so I felt it was a fundamentally anti-feminist film. And it made me sad and cross.
Do you feel in any way you betrayed her by kind of putting her into like the arms of this kind of Weinstein-esque Hollywood?
No, I don't feel I betrayed her because I wrote the book on her.
And you feel that is a seminal work, and you'd like that to be her legacy rather than the film.
Yeah, I believe the pen is mightier than the movie. Yeah.
Well, definitely.
So going back to Victoria's diaries, do you think that when she was writing them, that she intended for them to be kept for posterity? Was there a self-awareness in it? Do you think she was thinking this is the Queen of England, and I want my private thoughts to be recorded, or do you think she really was trying to achieve a certain amount of intimacy or privacy?
I think her diaries are fascinating because I think you have to read them as a writer, because I think they're always intended for an audience. I mean, I'm quite sure if Victoria was alive today, she would be tweeting like crazy. I mean, she liked attention and she liked to make her views. I mean, she's the polar opposite of our current queen, you know, who is the model of discretion. Victoria was not the model of discretion. She was, she'd never had any media training, let's put it that way. And I think what's interesting about her diaries is that I think they were always being read by somebody else. So they start, and they're being read by her mother. When she starts writing them she's about 12, they're always being read either by Lays and her governess or by her mother, the Duchess of Kent. So sometimes she's putting in stuff there where she's kind of getting at her mother and she knows her mother's going to read it. And then between her accession and her marriage to Albert. I think those are the most interesting diaries, because I think they're the only ones that aren't being read by anybody, because her mother's out of the picture. Lazen might have a look at them, but she's queen at that point. And those are the ones that are literally about Lord M. You know, every page is a kind of paean to Lord M. Lord M doesn't like earrings. He thinks blue doesn't suit me. He likes my new headdress. We talked about flogging. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I mean, I mean, if you read them, not as a historical record, but as somebody, as if she's an unreliable narrator. I mean, you know, you just know that she has the biggest crush in the world on this man. And, you know, that's what happens. But then when she gets married to Albert, the tone changes. It's all about how wonderful Albert is, my dearest, dearest angel, Albert. I think that Albert was reading her diary, because we know that.
Do you think she knew that he was?
Yes, she knew he was reading her diary. So I think it's a kind of transaction between them. And we know that from the accounts of courtiers that they had the most unbelievable rows. You know, they were a very tempestuous couple. They were the Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton of their time. And there's a great scene which I may use in a future series, where she throws a glass of wine over him in front of the whole court. Now, her diary the next day is, my dearest darling angel Albert, he's so wonderful, he's so angelic. I mean, she's protesting a bit too much, I think. So I think she uses the diary in those years as a way of, you know, apologising to him without actually having to apologise. So I think they are quite an interesting document from that point of view. And after that, well, of course, when we get to the John Brown years, those diaries were censored after her death by Princess Beatrice, who obviously took out anything that was interesting for us, sadly.
So, going back to your experience of having a film made about your book, obviously, you know, you've alluded to the limitations, but there are some ways in which the cinema or TV can actually portray historical detail in 1 minute, in a way that it will take pages and pages of detail to write in a book. Do you think there are any strengths of seeing history on screen as opposed to history on the page?
Oh, I completely agree with you. It is so true. So in the film Georgiana, there's a scene in which the Duchess, in which she has to give away up for adoption her illegitimate baby that she's had with Charles Grey, and it weeks and weeks of pain and anguish are compressed into 3 minutes. But it's immensely effective, and every time I watch that scene, I have tears in my eyes because of the way it's shot and the music and just a few words, and you grasp it. And one of the reasons I love Daisy's Victoria so much is that there are endless scenes where so much is packed in. One of my favourite scenes in Victoria is when Victoria and Albert are saying goodbye. He's going off to Germany for several weeks, and Victoria has her mother watching, and one of the uncles says, "Oh, well, I think there's going to be a wedding, don't you think?" And the mother says, "Yes, I hope I'm invited to it." and you've just sort of thrown in a whole chapter's worth of Victoria's life and her relationship with her mother in one line, and that's what film can do.
So I'm particularly fascinated by the idea of reading women's letters and really delving into their characters, delving into their thoughts. However, you know, in my own limited experience from writing my one book versus your many, I sometimes found that I was intruding in their privacy, in these women's privacy. And you've described, Amanda, the feeling of being an invisible, perhaps even an uninvited spectator while researching Georgiana. And Daisy, you've said that reading Victoria's diaries gave you an epiphany about her friskiness as a young girl. Have you ever felt a bit uncomfortable about this? Do you ever feel like you're an unwanted voyeur? Do you feel like you're a lurker?
No, I don't. I think Victoria would have been thrilled that she's now being portrayed as Amanda so rightly says, as a woman with agency who was, you know, who grew into her role. I think she would have been delighted, and I don't think she would have minded at all the fact that people realise how much she desired Albert and how passionate.
But you don't think that there's a notion of privacy, you think, when it comes to historical documents? I wouldn't read other people's letters now, and
I think they're dead. you know. And I think anything, I'm sorry, I think they're dead. And also, I think anything that can bring history to life, that makes people watch it. And I'm especially delighted that so many young women watch Victoria. It's got the highest sort of, you know, young audience of any period drama. I love that because it makes them feel that, you know, the past is not a separate country, it's not another country, it's actually, you know, this is a time when, and it might make them realise how lucky they are now to have contraception and the vote, you know, things that, poor Victoria, if Victoria had had contraception, just think how wonderful her life would have been, you know, really, 9 children, you know.
Yeah. And can I throw that question at you too? Do you feel that you have to protect the privacy of any of your protagonists, any of your characters when you're rifling through there?
Okay, well, there's 2 parts to that question. So the first part, that feeling of you know, privacy versus protection. There were times when I was researching Georgiana, it didn't happen very often, but occasionally I discovered something that she had done that told against her, that was a sort of humiliating for her because she had behaved in a way that showed her in a very bad light, and that was painful for me and I knew I'd have to write about it, and you know, I loved her very much, and I, you know, wished it was otherwise, and there was perhaps sometimes a temptation to lessen it, or you know, just slightly shape it in a way that wasn't as bad as it really was, but then of course you don't do that. It's just a feeling you have. The other thing I want to say is that, and I'm sure Daisy feels the same way, when you're writing about the past and you're writing about these people, you are the speaker for the dead. And so, for example, I'm now writing a history of women, and at the moment, right now, I'm concentrating on the very first women's letters we have in the world, and these were written in 1700 BC. And what's extraordinary about them, and it came from a particular royal family in the ancient Near East, and these are princesses writing home who are married, and they are utterly miserable. They are diplomatic brides, and one of them writes to say, if you don't get me home, I'm going to throw myself off the roof and kill myself. And this is an intensely private, desperate moment that I'm reading, and I am sure as hell going to get that into the book. Of course you are. Yes. I want her to be heard after 3,500 years of being silenced.
Is that very much a motive for both of you in bringing these extraordinary women to life, that you feel that you have a responsibility to them?
I feel with Victoria that, you know, the moment after she died, there was an attempt to repress her as a personality. So the first editors of her diaries were 2 men, Viscount Esher and Arthur Benson, both gay, both slightly, I think, revolted by the womanly side of her life. So basically her diaries, they cut out anything that was to do with her children or her emotional life, and they just kept it very much to the politics, to the process, to the ceremonial. And you know, that's all good, but actually I think Victoria is so much more interesting than that. And one of the things I think is so interesting about Victoria is that she is the first woman, the first queen regnant to marry and have children while she's on the throne. So she's the first, as it were, working mother. She's the prototypical working mother in England. And that is an extraordinary thing. You know, that, I think, I don't know if you agree, Amanda, but I think that sort of breaks the mould for women in the Victorian era. And so even though Victoria was by no means a supporter of votes for women, because of course she didn't need one, she
was the only vote, wasn't she?
She was the boss. But I mean, because of the fact that she was not only having children and being married, but was competent and doing her job, I think it changed the way that people regarded women. They realised that you didn't have to be a widow or an old maid to be trusted. You could be a married woman having children. You've got to remember that the word hysteria comes from the Greek meaning womb, you know, that you wouldn't necessarily, you could be a childbearing woman and not be hysterical. And that was a very important thing. I mean, it made a huge difference, I think, to the way that women were viewed in the 19th century.
I completely agree. I mean, one of the most marvellous aspects of biography is it allows women in particular to be themselves, not to be idealized, not to be saints, not to be sinners, but to be messy, ordinary people with complex and complicated lives. And sometimes they behave well, sometimes they behave badly, they make mistakes, they don't make mistakes. Everything kind of seeps out into the fringes. And that is the great joy and jewel of biography.
Yeah.
How significant do you think it is that you're both women writing about women? How do you think your approach, do you think there's a fundamental difference in the way that women approach history and men approach history?
I think, am I allowed to say this? Yes, I think yes. I mean, I don't think it's because I'm, no, I think, well, I don't know. Yes, I think women just, well, I know, I don't know whether it's individuals, but I'm more interested in restoring Victoria as a woman than I am in her kind of attitudes to, the 49 articles. I mean, I am very interested in how she was as a mother. I find her lack of guilt about her children so refreshing because, I don't know, as a working mother, I'm always guilty about how much time I'm spending with my children. Victoria never felt like that. And there is something gloriously sort of acerbic and astringent about her attitude towards these things. I don't know. What do you think, Amanda? I fear I'm going to be very politically incorrect, but that is what I feel.
I think it really depends. I mean, I know it's a wishy-washy answer, but it depends. I mean, I think, for example, when Lord David Cecil wrote his biographies, he could write really wonderfully about women, and I think about novelists like Thomas Hardy. His female heroines are extraordinary, and there's a depth and understanding of them in his writing which probably didn't exist in him as a human being, but comes out in his writing. And so, and at the same time, my previous book was about the American Civil War, and I don't think that my fact of my being a woman made me unable to write battle scenes. So so I think it's not the fact of our femininity, but it's the fact that we are writing from a different sensibility that may have been forced upon us. That if you have been excluded in various ways from the conversation, then you're going to be on the lookout in your subjects for ways that they may have been excluded to, and you will want to make sure that they are allowed to breathe and think and say and do in ways that you know yourself would have been the case, but because of their sex, because of gender roles, whatever, has been sort of deliberately written out of history.
But, I mean, I take your point about Thomas Hardy, but I'd much rather be Elizabeth Bennet than Tessa the D'Urbervilles, wouldn't you?
Yes, but then I think about someone like Bathsheba in Far From the Madding Crowd, and the way he describes her enthrallment to Troy, Colonel, whatever he is, Captain Troy.
But are they actors, That's the thing. I suppose. I'm sorry. I'm only picking up on this in the sense: do women write heroines who are actors, who are agents? I think is the point that you're saying. Whereas you look at Hardy's heroines, they come a cropper, don't they?
They do come a cropper, but are they punished for wanting to have agency?
Well, that's true. That's true.
But I think that's the advantage of having a woman write about a woman. However, there are some inescapable facts when researching or writing about women from history, and that is a lacuna in sources. So there's a really painful lack of archives. So many letters were disregarded, so many letters were just burned. So a lot of the women whose records we would like to rely on couldn't even write.
Yes.
So how do you reconcile that? That is, it's a very difficult and challenging thing to do.
Yes, and so much of women's history in the last 30 years has been a recovery, a system of recovery, and unfortunately, in many ways, it set back women's history. We were so busy having to go on a recovery mission that we haven't been able to do the other aspects of research and argument and analysis because we're too busy just finding it.
Well, thank God for Queen Victoria, because she wrote 62 million words in her lifetime. And although Princess Beatrice destroyed quite a few of them, you know, there's no shortage of her views on pretty much everything, actually. My favourite letter is the one she writes to the Home Secretary, where she says she's very worried about what they're doing to catch Jack the Ripper. And she says, have you thought about going to all the seamen's hostels in the East End and examine them for blood-stained clothing? And I just thought, you know, and I think that could be a future series, Queen Victoria, you know, Ripper Hunter.
You heard it here first. So one of the reasons I admire you both so much, that I consider you to be revisionist, you've definitely revised the way I view Victoria, and you have absolutely just, you know, you created this incredible character, Georgiana, who I imagine was just a footnote before in documents before you fell in love with her and decided to rescue her. What resistance have you come up against this kind of revisiting or revisionism you have of the past? Has there been, you know, have you had people criticise you?
I've taken a lot of stick for my portrayal of Victoria. You know, there's been a lot of sort of proto-feminist, you know, this woman, she wasn't like this at all, she's too pretty, she didn't flirt with her prime minister, you know, this is outrageous, how can you... you know, that's fair enough, that's their opinion, but I feel very strongly that my version of Victoria, yes, she is much prettier than the real Victoria, but on the other hand, if you're a queen, you are, you know, by very definition, very glamorous, aren't you? You are the most attractive person in the room if you're a queen. So I think, you know, that's my justification for casting the incredibly beautiful Jenna Coleman. But I think that in terms of how I've pitched it, I think people are just surprised that it's about her, and it's about her personality and her coming of age story. And I think they were surprised that I would choose to put her, and that I wouldn't just make it about her relationships, you know, because it's about her relationship with the country as well as about her relationship with Melbourne or with Albert or anything else. I mean, I'm very proud that the Victoria really does pass the Bechdel test, you know, the test where, you know, have you got a movie or something, a scene in a movie, we've got two women who are talking about something other than a man. Well, I think we can say that Victoria passes that test, as does Georgiana.
I mean, I think it's so true, Daisy, and one of the things I find so marvellous and so fascinating is that the power of film has the ability to change the cultural conversation so quickly. And one of the great successes I think about the series Victoria is how forcibly and quickly it has moved on the cultural conversation about how we view Victoria. One of the people who I noticed has been at this festival the last 2 days is the film producer Gail Ann Hurd. And two of the films that she produced are The Terminator and the film Aliens. And now, if you remember those two films, what makes them special is that they both feature an ordinary woman, Sigourney Weaver in one and Linda Hamilton in the other, who plays Sarah Connor, and they are downtrodden. They have no voice, and then through this series of extraordinary events, they end up saving the world, saving the planet, saving, you know, humanity. And that changed the cultural conversation of America, those two films, because never before had that story of a woman with that kind of agency ever been told. And then very quickly it became the norm. Of course, we're going to have films featuring women of that kind, but it had never happened before. And the same with Victoria. Now it's going to be, well, of course Victoria had agency, she was pretty, she was this, she was that. She has a story to tell, she's interesting not because of her relationships, but because of what she did and how she felt about that. And that's due to you. It's fantastic.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's due to... No, I didn't mean... Thank you, Amanda. That's what I meant to say. What I was trying to say before it sounded like... What I was trying to say was it's thanks to Victoria, actually, because I think one of the most interesting things about Victoria is that she, and that's why I think she would have liked the series, had a very clear sense of her own brand. So, you know, and one of the things I find so interesting about her is at the age of 4, she says she's not speaking German at home, even though her mother's German and everybody around her is German. Because I think she knows, even at the age of 4, that to be a German-speaking English princess is not a good idea. And then when she comes to the throne, the other thing I think is so interesting is that, you know, she's got this, you know, she's always called Drina. Her first name is Alexandrina. Her mother calls her Drina. Everybody calls her Drina, or My Blumen. And then when she comes to the throne, they say, well, what do you want to call yourself, ma'am? Do you want to call yourself Elizabeth or Charlotte or, you know, one of these kind of Anne or Mary, one of these royal names? She says, no, I'm going to call myself Victoria. And then they're like, what? Because Victoria is not a name in Victorian England, amazingly. It's not a name. It's like calling yourself Beyonce. It's this kind of extraordinary made-up name. And everyone is just astonished. But, you see, I think that Victoria had this very strong sense of nominative self-determinism. She knew that this was a name that she wanted. Victory. She was going to win, and she did, and she chose a name. And whatever you say about her agency in the 19th century, she certainly succeeded in that one thing. She moulded that century in her image. It's the Victorian age, isn't it?
And it is, and it's so fascinating you say that, because in the 7th century in China, there's the only female emperor that China's ever had in its history, and she didn't have a name, because in those days, Chinese women did not have a personal name. They took on the name of their husbands. And the first thing she did when she declared herself empress was that she gave herself a name. She called herself Empress Wu Zetian. And she had a particular character made up to represent her name. She invented her name. And I think you've picked on something incredibly important, as you say, nominative self-determinism. Because for hundreds and hundreds of years, women took the surnames of their husbands. They lost themselves. They lost their names, and it's only now that women can hold on to their names. So it's a really powerful thing, this naming business.
Yes.
So from the business of nominative self-determinism,
I can't like the phrase du jour. I think.
How do you, from that? From then, how do you start about developing a voice for these characters? Because you're reading her diaries, which are in her language. But how do you avoid being archaic? How do you avoid being cliched? Or how do you avoid being anachronistic? How do you then go from reading the pages of these diaries to actually translating that into dialogue that we all gobble up at 9 p.m. on a Sunday night?
Well, I think I've read an awful lot of Victorian fiction, which helps. And actually, Howard Jacobson, who was here at the festival earlier, he paid me the ultimate compliment by saying, well, he watches Victorian and he really likes it because it reminds him of his favourite Victorian novels. There's a Jane Eyre figure, there's a Mr. Rochester figure, and so I was very pleased by that. But so that helps. So I've got an ear for the language, and I would never have Victoria say okay or whatevs. I mean, it just wouldn't come into my head. I think it's the voice thing. I don't know. I'm going to sound a little bit sort of what's the word, lovey here, but actually her voice comes into my head in a rather spooky way, and I always know. I have a voice for Victoria. I know what she's going to say, and I very rarely find myself looking at her. I mean, I do sometimes think, oh, did they say Nutcracker in 1837? But usually I find that the way I have her speak is pretty much of the period, because I think the thing that we forget is that actually in Victorian England, demotic speak wasn't that different from the way we speak now. So quite often I have people say, I believe instead of I think, or sort of little verbal changes are different. But actually demotic speak, we think of them all talking, as if they were, I don't know, from another world, but they don't. They actually talk quite like we do. And if you read Anthony Trollope, who I think is one of the most conversational of the 19th century novelists, you can see that a lot of that dialogue goes straight onto the page. You put that straight onto the page. And I found Trollope a fantastic resource for how would people actually speak to each other. You can get confused because obviously they say he made passionate love to her, which does not mean in a Victorian novel what it means now. That's probably he held her hand, or maybe a quick kiss or something. But I think you can. I don't find that a problem, and there probably are anachronisms, but I do go through it with a kind of inner filter, and I think that's because actually I don't think I've read anything that hasn't been written in the 19th century for the last 3 years, so that may be part of it.
And the collaborative process between you and Jenna Coleman, is that something that's creatively quite significant for you? Do you bounce off each other? How has that worked in terms of her realising your vision for Victoria?
It's really interesting because, you write your script, and there is no greater feeling of power and excitement when you go to the first read-through and you have the actors read your lines, so you're like, wow, I'm in charge here, this is the biggest the most exciting train set anybody will ever have. But then as you go into production, you realise that actors don't just read your lines, they don't just say what they're meant to say, they have opinions, and some of them have quite forceful opinions. Jenna, it has to be said, is a delight. She does her research, she is extremely scrupulous about thinking about every line, what does it mean? It's not so much the words, it's about what's the intention here. She will pick me up. If ever I've done a lazy bit of writing or I've been a bit sloppy about something, she will notice, and that's fine, because I actually enormously respect her opinion. Rufus Sewell, when we were doing Lord Melbourne, was a nightmare, I have to say. I mean,
do you want to elaborate on that?
The most delectable nightmare one can imagine, the most handsome and delectable nightmare one can imagine. But I remember having a conversation with him where, I don't know if you remember, there's a scene in when they're in Windsor Castle and they're talking about Oliver Twist, and there's a famous scene from there's an entry in Victoria's Diaries where she's talking about the fact that she and Melbourne talked about Oliver Twist, and he said, I don't want to read about Oliver Twist. Who wants to read about, chimney sweeps and undertakers? I mean, it's enough to know they exist. I don't want to read about them. Anyway, I put a similar line like that in the script, and Rufus said, well, I don't think that Lord M would say that. And I go, well, actually, Rufus, he did say that. And there was a long pause, and he said, yes, but I don't think my Lord M would say that. And so we compromised.
There were creative differences.
Well, I think it wasn't a creative difference. He was right, because he thought that it would make Melbourne too unsympathetic, and no actor wants to be unsympathetic unless they're playing a villain, and in which case, And so we compromised, and it was fine. And actually, I think as a writer, I've learned it's very important to listen to actors, because if they have a problem with a line, there's usually a reason why they've got a problem with it. Although sometimes they can just be being really annoying, in which case you just have to kind of listen and listen and listen, and it'll go away, and then it'll all be as it was before. So. Yes, it's a lesson.
I'm listening to both of you. You are incredibly passionate about your subjects. Do you think there's a risk of over-identifying?
Well, I just want to add something very quickly to what Daisy just said, because I remember that scene, and what I think you did was really fascinating. So you have Victoria, she says her thing about Oliver Twist, then Albert says a line, in which I think he says that everyone should be reading it, and then Melbourne says, well, no, I don't want to, and then Albert says, but how are you going to know about your country unless you read about it? And then you think, gosh, that's a thud, how on earth is he going to come back from that? And then you have Melbourne saying back, which is so marvellous, and of course Rufus Sewell delivers it in a wonderfully nuanced way. He says, I have been running the government for the last 10 years.
Yes.
and so it's these, again, what we were saying earlier about being able to encapsulate an enormous amount into 3 lines of dialogue. And
yes, well, of course, we that conversation stopped being about what Melbourne had said, and it became entirely about sexual tension.
Well, it's a ferociously male put down, isn't
yes,
it?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Oh, it just works so
well.
well.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
So, about over-identifying.
Over-identifying. When you over-identify, then you failed in your profession. You're a bad craftsperson. I don't know what you're going to do, but don't do the writing. Don't be a historian. Whatever. You can't. Do you know what I mean? Mm. There are certain things you have to be as a professional writer, historian, dramatist, and one of them is you don't over-identify. Get a therapy. Go and see a shrink. If that's your thing, because it's not about you.
No. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to slightly differ with you there, Amanda, because I'm afraid there was a certain amount of joking about Your Majesty in my household, and there was a very funny moment when the first Victoria came out, and somebody who'd been at school with me who's a film producer actually, who'd been at school with me when I was 18. He said, well, I know who the young Queen Victoria reminds me of. So I think inevitably when you're writing fiction, you do put yourself into characters. So maybe there are times when I'm not quite sure. This isn't a mental health announcement, by the way. I'm not quite sure where I end and Victoria begins. And I think it's simply because I'm trying to get to a point of truth, and the only way that you can get to truth is to try and to sort of, it's sort of like acting in a way that you have to think, how would you feel about this? But I do know the difference between me and Queen Victoria. I hasten to add. I mean, I'm not like...
There's about 4 inches at least, isn't
well,
it?
at least 4 inches and 7 children. But, you know, but Amanda's absolutely right. You have to be detached. You have to be able to say the unpalatable things.
I'm not saying it's about detachment, because I hear what you're saying and I agree with you. I think it's the difference between identification and authenticity.
Yes.
And so to achieve authenticity, you have to inhabit, and it has to seep into your soul, I think, for it to sing the way it should. But that doesn't mean that you are living through them.
And I think your task, if I may, in living through Georgiana was probably more onerous than your task of living through Victoria, because as you write so eloquently, Georgiana was an addict.
Yeah.
She was a gambling addict, she had food issues. To actually identify so strongly with someone who had these mental health issues, you have to draw that boundary, otherwise you get sucked into this vortex of despair and it's...
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was talking to Anne Applebaum this morning. She's written 3 books about Eastern Europe, Stalinist Europe, the Gulag, life behind the Iron Curtain, and now the famine in Ukraine. And I asked her, I said, how do you live with yourself when you're writing about such horrors every day? And she said, I'm quite an unhappy person inside, and so so this is a way for me to be able to kind of get some distance from my own emotions, let alone what I'm reading on the page.
And I've actually always found Victoria a great inspiration to me, because while I was writing the series, I had a number of disasters of one kind or another. My house burnt down, etc., etc. But actually, what I found about Victoria was her extraordinary ability to carry on. She lost her husband, she lost three children while she was still alive. There were endless disasters, but she had this extraordinary curiosity about life, which kept her going, and that, I have to say, rather inspired me.
Quintessential stiff British.
Well, no, it wasn't that. No. I don't think she had a stiff upper lip. Not at all. No, she was always blobbing, and they were, everyone was always crying a lot in the 19th century, including men, by the way. But I think what was nice about Victoria was that she was, she never plunged into despair, because she was always quite interested in what her dresser had for breakfast. She had a sort of incredible curiosity for the mundane and the quotidian, which I find really charming, and that's the thing that's kind of kept me...
So we're going to have to stop in a minute to open the floor to questions, but I'm just going to allow myself one indulgence. So did you read about Clifden in the Victoria Diaries? Because she was great friend. She was best friends with Harriet, Duchess of Sutherland, and you were saying she mentioned Lord M in her diary so much. She mentioned Harriet, Duchess of Sutherland a lot as well. And I just think I'd love you to say just a couple of things about Victoria's relationship with Clifden, seeing as though we're sitting here in the Great Hall.
They used to, she was just down the river at Windsor, and she used to pop up here for tea with Harriet all the time. And didn't they, I think it was in one of those houses down on the river, where
in Spring Cottage they'd have
Spring Cottage
walks.
They had tea, and I believe that they invented sort of afternoon tea to have down there to fill the long hours between the 12-course lunch and the 19-course dinner.
And they used to bathe together, didn't they? They used to swim together.
They used to swim together, and I'm afraid I've made my Harriet, Duchess of Sutherland in my series a bit of a sort of, she's only got eyes for Prince Ernest, but the real Duchess of Sutherland was a very moral lady who had 11 children and was devoted.
She's in the dining room over there in the Winter.
But she does look rather like Margaret Clooney.
She does, doesn't
this long,
she?
beautiful,
very
dark
beautiful
hair.
and ethereal.
Yes.
And also in the West Wing over there's a pushing stick that Queen Victoria would use to push Harriet Duchess of Sutherland along on one of their walks when Harriet got older and much bigger. They were so dedicated, devoted to each other that, you know, when Harriet was too fat to walk, the Queen Victoria would push her along, which I find rather charming.
And I think that says something about Victoria, doesn't it? That she had a very good female friend.
Who was Georgiana's granddaughter?
There we go.
So it's
full circle. Yes.
So on that lovely historical symmetry, I'm going to open the floor to some questions. Anyone? I mean, I'll keep going.
Happy to keep going.
No, there's a question.
Thank you. That was a wonderful, incisive panel. I just wanted to ask Daisy, we've heard a lot about Victoria. Could you just let us know a little bit more about Albert's role in the relationship and the relationship that they had together, and how many lovers did she really have?
Ooh, my goodness. Well, I mean, Albert was definitely the love of her life, and you know, it's clear that it was a coup de foudre, and they had a very, very strong physical bond. I think that it's been one of the challenges for me as to how do you make a German prince who's basically the Steve Jobs of his time. How do you make him sexy? And I just decided that, you know, it helped that you have Tom Hughes, who does look remarkably like the young Prince Albert. There's a photograph of him in 1842 where he has a profile just like Tom's. And I think their relationship was a very interesting one because he was incredibly well educated, he'd been to university, he was a polymath, you know, he knew everything. He was president of the Statistical Association, he founded the Great Exhibition. He was a man who could turn his hand literally to everything, from plumbing to higher mathematics. He was an extraordinary, extraordinary man. And I think he found some of Victoria's interests, which were basically, you know, she was more curious and she hadn't been very well educated. He sometimes found that annoying. However, what he loved about her, I think, was the fact that he'd lost his mother when he was 5 years old because she'd run away. His parents split up, she was banished from the kingdom, he never saw her again. So he was desperate for that emotional security, and Victoria provided that, because while he was alive, she never looked at another man, and he never looked at another woman, which is very unusual, as we know, for royal marriages. And so they were a very, very strong couple in that sense. But I think they had issues. I mean, one of the things I think that always worried Albert was Victoria, and this is a sort of interesting construct, isn't it? Was Victoria going to go mad? Because, you know, there was insanity in the family. Remember, George III, her grandfather, had gone mad, and there was a real worry, I think, that Victoria, when she got a bit sort of heated, was she, you know, you wouldn't think it about a man, but when it's a woman, was she actually, you know, was she showing signs of volatility? So he, you know, Leopold was always saying to him, you need to watch out. And so sometimes when they were having a really, really bad row, he would just retreat and write her notes and refuse to talk to her. Can you imagine how annoying that must have been for her? You know, you're the queen and you can't get your husband to talk to you, can't get your husband on the phone, as it were. He will only send you a note. So I think that their relationship, but on the other hand, they love doing things together. You know, they're always painting together, etching together, playing the piano together. They spend a lot of time together. You know, they hardly spend a night apart in their whole marriage. So it's a very, very close relationship. They build houses together. They have their children. I mean, you know, they were married for 21 years. So there were obviously moments of tension. But I think it was a successful marriage, probably the most successful royal marriage for a very long time. And I think together what they created was the British monarchy as we know it now, because without Victoria and Albert, you wouldn't have Philip and Elizabeth. I mean, you know, they made the monarchy safe, because if you think about it, in 1848, monarchies were being toppled all over Europe, and the British monarchy, just a tiny little whimper of a Chartist protest on Kennington Common, you know, and everybody went home because it rained. Nobody thought seriously about getting rid of the Queen, because the Queen and Albert had somehow managed to get beyond the sort of trappings of kingship and speak directly to the people. So, you know, there's a very interesting moment when you see the first photographs of Victoria and Albert. And if you think about it, before that, all the people had seen of her were paintings of her in her ceremonial robes with her crown and her sceptre and her orb. And then suddenly you see a photograph of her wearing an ordinary dress, a cotton dress with a kind of a hat and a kind of, you know, she just looks just like one of us.
So she made royalty accessible.
Accessible, and I think that was her great contribution, and she and Albert did that together. And I genuinely think that without Victoria and Albert, we wouldn't have a royal family today.
I totally agree. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the British monarchy is that for the past 200 years it's been dominated by queens. And one of the interesting features of that is that if you look at the European view and concept of what royalty and monarchy is, it's wealth, it's power, it's militarism, whereas in this country, starting with Queen Victoria, the message was family, duty, loyalty.
Yeah.
It's these are very different values, and family coming first.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Oh, there's a question.
There's
There's
a
a brave
hand.
questioner
There we
at
go.
the back.
Oh, the very back. Yeah.
Someone can ask me if watching Victoria will help you pass your history GCSE, if you like.
Hello. I suppose I'm asking this from an acting perspective, but I'm really interested in all of your processes as writers. How did you find, like, initially being confronted with such an iconic, both cases really iconic, female figure as a woman and a historical icon? What was it like for both of you, all of you, kind of going towards that research marathon and crafting these women on the page and eventually screens?
Well, for me, having a teenage daughter really helped, because, you know, I felt if she could have half the sort of spirit and passion, and, you know, I could feel those hormones pulsing through the character that I could see in my daughter, then I felt it would be all right. I mean, that was the most germane research in a way, and then I think, you know, the fact and fiction thing is a really difficult one, because what I've tried to do, I mean, to come back to the history GCSE question, I mean, I've made a lot of it up, obviously. I mean, I've made a lot of conversations up. Who knows what people said to each other at different times. On the other hand, the facts are always true. So, you know, tonight's episode is about the Corn Lords. I mean, God knows if I've managed to make that sexy, but you can watch that, and if you don't understand the Corn Lords by the end of it, then I will have failed. And similarly with the Irish famine, which I did...
Which you handled so well. And
I'm glad you think so, yes.
And I love that you made the star of it was one of your relations.
He was my great-great-grandfather. So I was astonished, because when I came to research that my family history, I found this character who'd been this kind of hero in the Irish potato famine. Thank goodness, because it would have been awful if he'd kind of starved the Irish. But the point was that, I mean, I don't know about you, but I studied 19th century history. I knew very little about what we'd done to the Irish in 1845 to 1848. I mean, and I was so horrified that I decided I must make this part of the series. And I actually used, you know, some of the lines that they use in the show, where he says, well, it's a natural correction, you know, yeah, there's a famine and that's what happens, people are going to die, but, you know, then it'll all be fine. That's what people were saying in the British government at the time, and it was the most extraordinary thing. I mean, I think our treatment of the Irish in the 19th century is something that we really don't know enough about and don't feel ashamed enough of.
Yes, well, that's why, you know, Jonathan Swift wrote a modest proposal in 1720 in which he advocated, you know, well, the Irish are starving, perhaps they should be eating their children, and it was a way of trying to shock the English out of their complacency.
Absolutely.
But to go back to your point about, you know, how do you craft a character? So, for example, with Georgiana and her friend Bess, two very strong women, I very consciously and deliberately had a lexicon of words that I only used for each character, so that as the reader encountered these two women, there would be a kind of sentence structure that I only used for one or the other. Georgiana's sentences were expansive, soft syllables, words that were somehow evoked more than. And with Bess, her sentences were more clipped. The kinds of words and adjectives I used were to kind of give the sense of a bird-like, character who was tense, uptight, self-created, much more clipped. And I think that's what happens in drama as well, is that your choice of words is very, very deliberate.
Yes.
Okay, I think unfortunately, do we have time for one more question, or are we?
Yeah, someone's brave enough to ask one. There's a man over there.
Oh, woohoo!
And then here we've got
Yeah.
got two more.
Do the scenes tend to come out on screen as you imagine them while you're writing them?
Oh, that's a very good question. No, the answer to that is no. Well, some do and some don't. The scenes where I wrote one scene in the first episode before it got filmed where they're all talking in front of a lion tamer. And, you know, because Queen Victoria was very keen on this lion tamer called Macready, and I thought this would be fantastic with this wonderful scene, and they're talking about jeopardy and, you know, the nation in peril, and there's a lion being tamed in the background. And finally, somebody said, I don't think we've talked about the lion in the room, which is that there is no way that we can have a lion and a lion tamer in this show, because it's just, you know, that would eat up our whole budget. So sometimes they're not, okay? And sometimes they say, yes, we know you've written 300, the regiment of the Highland, the household cavalry is going to be there, but could we get by with 3 soldiers? And we were like, okay. So that sort of thing. But then when you write something like the Rook scene where Melbourne and Victoria goes to see Melbourne, she proposes to him, and then actually, it's better than I imagined because they've got it so right. They've got the right setting with this kind of division of the ways. The sun comes out at the right time. The actors do it beautifully, and then it's much better than I'd ever had in my head. And then I'm eternally grateful. And actually, that was a very embarrassing scene to film because I was there when they did it, and they stopped at one point. I thought, why are they stopping? And of course, they were stopping because I was sobbing so hard that they could hear me. And Rufus said, oh, shut up. But, the point is he didn't really mind because actually no actor minds if they make you cry, So, yes, mostly they come out as I imagine. But when they don't, I get a bit frustrated. But on the other hand, when they do work and they work better than you imagine, then it's such a treat. There's a gentleman
Time for
over
one
there.
more question.
Do you have a hunger for more? You've both created such beautiful pieces. Is there a hunger to kind of find something else, find another character, some uncharted territory to kind of bring to life?
You know what? I wrote Georgiana in 1998, and I have been unable to write another biography since. She had such a profound effect on me. It's like, penguins mate for life. I wish I could write another.
And Rooks, I think you'll find.
And Rooks, yeah. It's been a sort of strange aspect of my career that I can't bring myself to write another biography because of her.
Yeah, and I sort of second that. I'm terrified. I'm not sure if I could write about anyone other than Victoria, but on the other hand, I was just talking earlier with Antonia Fraser about Caroline Lamb and what a great story that would be. And then I suddenly felt that sort of peak of interest. So I think, so long as you feel that curiosity, you can you can find the moment to go for it. But I think I definitely, whatever I do, it will be about a woman, without question.
Well, hopefully this weekend at Clifden will inspire you both.
Yeah,
You'll
definitely.
be able to come back next year and talk about your epiphanies.
Definitely.
Thank you very, very much, Daisy. Thank you very, very much, Amanda.